several months from now, I'm planning to go to Southeast Asia, spend some time in Vietnam, and then also spend a brief time in Chiang Mai in Thailand, which will be a sort of a launching pad into Burma. And so as I've been preparing for this, it's going to involve a lot of walking with a pack. I think you know a little bit about that sort of thing. We might talk about that. And so one of the things I'm doing to prepare is I'm going on long walks with, 40-pound pack, and I'm also working on the Korean language a bit, and I'm attending a church that is a Korean congregation here where I live. And then I wanted to do some reading on Burma. And so the only book that I knew off the top of my head that had anything to do with Burma was Orwell's book, Burma Days. Is that right? Burma or Burmese Days? Yeah.
Burmese.
Yeah, Burmese. So anyway, so I went to the bookstore to find that book. Southeast Asia section, Burma section, no Orwell, but there was a memoir called Burmese Looking Glass by a person called Edith Mirante. And so I went looking for Orwell and ended up with Mirante. And the first book I read about Burma. And I'm really glad that that's what happened. First of all, because what you describe in this memoir is, it gives me a little bit of insight maybe into just a few of the things that I might experience. Your experience is obviously much, much, much more extensive than anything I'll experience, but a little bit of insight of that. But also, I'm glad I read it because it's just so fantastically written. You clearly have a great facility with written English. And then I noticed as going through the memoir, you mentioned, you're learning Mandarin to get around in Mandarin, learning Thai, often using Thai in Burma to communicate with folks who understand Thai. And you describe various situations where different languages are in play. And then through the memoir, you also give snippets of other languages. So it became clear to me, or at least I think it, my impression from the memoir is that you're attentive to language and to the different languages that are being spoken, in addition to being quite skilled in your own native language. So just to get this conversation started, I'm interested in just when it was in your own case that you became sort of aware of this in yourself, that of an interest in language generally.
Well, I was one of those children who was read to, and grew up in a house full of books. My parents were both involved with libraries. It seemed almost inevitable that both me and my brother would end up writing books, so we did.
Oh.
That first book, Burmese Looking Glass, was not easy, so compliments for it are always taken to heart, because that's where I really, really learned to write.
Yeah.
I had written reports and art history analysis, that kind of thing, so I knew that kind of nonfiction writing. But this was one of the last of the typewritten books. I typed it over and over again, cut and pasted it literally with scissors and paste, and it was thick with whiteout. When I met my editors at Grove Press, both of them had really short haircuts, and I thought, they are going to cut this book. And they did. It was an enormous pile of typewritten pages. And so they cut it, and that's how I really learned how to write something with flow.
Mm-hmm.
It was also based on, at least at the beginning, letters I had written to my brother from the Thai-Burma border. And when I talked to writing classes, I advised them to think that they're writing to somebody. I mean, I've written more recent books basically based on my own emails to my husband, served as a template, trying to communicate with somebody in that sense. And as far as language, I'm actually not that good at other languages unless it's picked up completely in context.
Right, okay.
I lived in a house in Bangkok, which was people from France, the United States, and Thailand living there. So there was this sort of house dialect that was a combination of English, French, and Thai.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow I absorbed, and I basically still think in that, even though I haven't been back to Thailand because I got kicked out. The 1980s Thai phrases are constantly coming first to my mouth, mixed in with like bad French and English. So what all of this did not leave room for was Burmese, unfortunately. Burmese is a very grammatically complicated language. I know basically just enough to get from one place to another. I've tried learning online Burmese courses, and there was one where you sort of score your proficiency, and I kept getting a good score on it. But then by the next time I logged on, I'd like forgotten everything.
Oh, yeah.
And most of the places in Burma that I was, Burmese was very much a second or third language anyway in the ethnic area. So as you mentioned, Chinese was more useful, and there were constantly people who spoke English as well.
Right, and now
language proficiency, it would be like to get all the Thai vocabulary replaced with Burmese, but it hasn't happened.
Yeah, well, I've studied a number of languages myself, and one of the challenges with Karen is that it's not a state-supported language, and so the resources are there. I just haven't been able to find very many resources, and the main resource I have right now are the folks at this Karen congregation, and we just make recordings together.
Resource you could have, definitely have, a native speaker just to sit down with you and teach you the things you need to know.
Yeah.
And you'll be great ahead of the game. Not that many people make the effort to learn Karen, so that's really nice.
Yeah. Well, you even just a few of the things you said just sort of resonate with me. Just real quickly, things you learned in Thai some 25 years ago. You said those phrases still stick with you. And I couldn't help but to relate the things I was reading this memoir with some of my own experiences, and sort of a formative place for me early on in life, around the same time you're in Thailand and Burma, was Quebec, and it's still, I've been back to Quebec a lot, and Quebec obviously is very, very different, but it's interesting how still phrases that I learned in French back then are still sort of with us. I guess it's that formative stage in life.
Yeah.
But let's you mentioned that you're not allowed to go to Thailand. Now that goes back to, is it the early 90s when the Thai government said they were done with Edith Mirante?
1988 specifically.
88.
Big year in Burma. There was a student uprising and a lot of changes there, but that was the second time I got deported from Thailand, so I can take a hint. And I don't know what the statute of limitations are, but in reality it served a purpose, because instead of going to the Thai-Burma border, where quite a few aid workers, journalists, and so on were eventually, sent me over to the other frontiers of Burma, which is what my second book, Down the Rat Hole, deals with. The China border, the Bangladesh border, most significantly probably, which is where the Rohingyas are. And so I had learned about them back in the early 90s. From just thinking, let's see what's going on the Bangladesh border. Little did I know that there was so much going on there. And then even the borders with India and Laos, which are
why did,
relative to the Thai border?
Why did I'm wondering, if you could spell this out a little bit more, because, I've talked to people. It's interesting to me. I'd be interested in hearing you talk about this too, but it's interesting to me that I hear people, in fact, I think I've heard you say in one of the lectures you give, just sort of in a public lecture that's posted online, that you basically cross illegally into Burma all the time. Or, you just sort of cross the border and don't.
It was casual back then, I would say. a huge smuggling trade in consumer goods from Thailand to Burma. There were drugs coming out of Burma to Thailand.
Yeah.
Were well-traveled routes. So, you know, me and my little pony and the whichever guerrilla army from Burma I was with, these things were kind of well plotted out and standard. I mean, not necessarily standard for foreigners at the time.
Right.
Later on, the border became much more patrolled and policed, as it certainly is today. And relationships between the two countries became very different. Back then, this was kind of a buffer zone for Thailand, where they had kind of tolerant relationships with armies that were rebelling against the Burmese government.
Yeah.
Now it's much less of a tolerated thing.
What is the tolerated thing? I'm sorry.
That at this point, yeah, it's not something to do as routinely as I did back then.
Oh. Okay.
And then other border crossings later on from the China border have to be done very carefully to this day.
Really?
Journalists and other investigators go across there, but it's not quite the same game as it was back then.
Huh. Well, so I mean, you know, I hear people still talk about, you know, I know that, you know, I don't want to mention names right now, but if, you know, there's one name I think that you know of. I recently spoke to a person who still, you know, pretty regularly, you know, crosses from Thailand into Burma and doesn't worry about visas and things like that. And
Yeah,
that was
been some very specialized contacts.
okay.
Not that it's not doable, but I mean, back then I would just say I'm going up to the border and get on the back of a truck, you know, so it was different back then.
Well,
and also I was, when I would run into, say, Border Patrol, I managed to pull off the just being a tourist who got lost a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So I was wearing camouflage pants and spoke Thai. I was like, oh, I'm just a tourist. And they're like, oh, of course.
Yeah. Well, why did you, I mean, spell this out a little bit. I mean, why you get thrown into jail and get deported? But there are other people who are, you know, you say back in this time, who are moving back and forth. So why did you get targeted? Because there are other folks who've been at it for a couple of decades who are still crossing.
I was made an example of politically at a time when Thailand and Burma were getting much closer together politically, and there were logging deals going on, and so the idea that there were these outsiders investigating things up along the borders started to be objectionable to Thailand. And I think the reason why they decided to really make it stick with me was to show other people that this was not an acceptable thing to be doing any longer.
I see.
Of course, you know, it's been done ever since by many people. And then the other side of this is that back in the 80s, during the Burmese Looking Glass time, there wasn't a lot of outside access for anyone in these frontier areas to the world. They could try smuggling letters out. Obviously, there was no internet, but there was no phone. There was nothing like that to get information out. So I was able to use my abilities as a foreigner to interview people and get their actual stories out. In the interim, there's been amazing training of people from Burma doing their own human rights investigation. And that's the most important aspect, is that these civil society groups who put themselves at enormous risk to this day, it's dangerous for them, even though things changed a lot in Burma or Myanmar.
Yeah.
It's still a dangerous pursuit to gather information, whether it's on environmental issues or violence against women, ethnic persecution, or even genocide in the Rohingya areas.
Yeah.
These are all things that people from the country themselves are fully capable of doing now. So for the outsiders like me, now it's more of a question of just amplifying those voices or pointing people in the direction of particular issues that aren't being paid attention to enough. And that's my function with my information project, Project Maje. What I do is connect people up with sources of information on Burma issues, particularly in the ethnic areas or the frontier areas, environmentally related, human rights related. And so if a journalist or an organization needs to find out about a particular aspect, then I can find somebody for them who can tell them what's going on with that or find a piece of information.
Yeah.
And of course, the funny thing is that now I've become this kind of de facto historian just because I've been on this so long. So
Yeah.
the 1980s for young journalists now is practically like what World War II was for me back then.
I think that's right.
I'm able to just here's a first-hand picture of the Karenni army, back in 1987 or something.
Yeah.
Just happened to have that stuff.
Yeah.
I kept loads of hard copies of manifestos and newsletters and everything I found from all the groups there. And that has ended up at the Yale University Library as an archive of hard copies on what was going on the Burma borders from the 80s and 90s. So research continues that, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then I have cardboard boxes surrounding me in my office. It's all in the perfect place for it.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting is that I'm curious about is there are a lot of striking moments in this memoir. One of them is you're in jail. It's near the end of the memoir, and I forget exactly what you use, but you write a message on the wall. Death to, is it Ne Win or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And I think you refer to yourself a couple times as kind of a revolutionary. In fact, I think that's in the subtitle, right? A jungle revolution or something like that. Listening to you talk, though, you don't strike me as a revolutionary. And then, just whatever stereotypical images we might have in our mind of what revolutionaries are like. And then in your book, another passage I noted was that you, at least at that time, you said, I'm not really into, I'm paraphrasing now, I'm not really into ideology, I'm not into philosophy, and I'm not into theology. So I'm interested in what's the motivation? Because you've been at this for a while now, as you just indicated. What is the underlying motivation that, you can understand a young person being fascinated by something at the moment, but this is something you really persisted in over time. How would you describe the underlying motivation?
Well, I certainly have revolutionary sympathies. I'm not wearing a beret with a star on it or anything.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm still not ideologically or philosophically or theologically inclined. Not a big abstract thinker.
Yeah.
Basically, people ask me to do this. Sometimes the metaphor that I use, like when I'm speaking to school kids, is if you heard coal miners trapped beneath the ground calling for help, your responsibility would be to go and try and find somebody to help them.
Yeah.
If you didn't hear them, they were down there, you keep walking, you don't know. But I knew.
Yeah.
People told me directly and asked me directly, get this information out, tell our stories, help us tell our stories. So that's how I started doing it. I certainly didn't expect to still be doing Burma work in 2019. And there was even a few moments around 2014, 2015 when I thought, okay, this is great, it's done. And in fact, I wrote a book about a non-Burma topic, Wind in the Bamboo, which is about other indigenous people in Southeast Asia and the Philippines, Andaman Islands, and Malaysia, and their issues, and went to those countries and researched it. But then it just got, pulled back into the Burma situation, particularly because the Rohingya are an experienced their experience is something that I've known about for so long. And then also the war in Kachinland in the north on the China border area is something that I've been very deeply involved with. And after a long ceasefire, that war started up again in 2011. So then I found myself back in their headquarters and going up to the front lines where the shelling was happening. Still some responsibility for these people, and there is a role for me to play, again, connecting people up to their information. Not about me being there, but making the connections for people and trying to help with that.
So it does.
After all this time, it's like my burnout has burnout. I mean, I have absorbed so much bad human rights documentation. But you get used to hearing these things, and you get used to understanding these things. And it still has an effect when I started seeing the cell phone videos that the Rohingyas were taking as they were fleeing their villages in 2016. That still had a deep, deep effect on me, because I knew what this looks like. I know what people fleeing looks like. I knew what Bangladesh, where they would end up, looked like. So it's not that I'm completely, battle hardened by all this. At the same time, I've been doing it for a really long time, and I know how to function within that environment.
It does sound like
information can be effective as a tool of, as it were, revolution, some kind of revolution.
Yeah, it does sound like a very practical approach, which actually I appreciate. Very practical, that I have knowledge the overwhelming majority of people don't have. I've seen it, and there's something I can do, and so there's that sense of responsibility.
Yeah, and when I started out, when this kind of got assigned to me by an old man named Yoshu, who said, somebody's been human rights abused, you have to come interview him. And it hadn't occurred to me to do that kind of thing. I said, okay, because I had worked for a design company in market research, writing focus group reports. So I knew how to conduct an interview with, proper interviewing techniques and how to write a report from it. So there was a nice transition, actually, from market research into human rights documentation.
Yeah, there's a passage in the book. You can see it's really nicely, a lot of sticky notes in it. But there's one passage I really loved, and what you just said reminded me of this passage, where, let me see, where did it go here? It's right near the end, and you're doing office temp work. So you mentioned doing the temp work. There are two passages I think I want to sort of link up here. So this is near the end, and let me see. I would be doing office temp work in the relentlessly monotonous confines of an engineering firm. The day before my 35th birthday, I would be sitting in a beige cubicle typing the words chargeable service over and over again on forms, and then you have chargeable service, chargeable service, chargeable service. And so then, skipping to the next page, I would practice the art of collating and other menial tasks at the engineering firm by day, and the art of revolution by telephone and typewriter by night. And of course, I like the typewriter bit there, because a lot of people don't know what that is. So I love that image of somebody who's sort of doing this, uninteresting work in the States, but then you've got this, and that's what most people see, or that's what everybody sees around you. But then you've got this private world that you're pursuing, and then there's this passage here, and this is at a moment, I forget the exact context here, but this is at a moment where, I guess you had a dream, and there are instructions that you're following. I forget the exact context here. But and for a while things looked, suspiciously good. But it soon went back to the usual mess. My paintings wouldn't sell. I had no money. The U.S. was massively boring. Burma was a lost cause, right? Now that passage there comes, I don't know, 30, 40 pages before you're in that office, doing office work by day, revolutionary by night. And so that just gets to the theme of perseverance. And let me tell you why I'm so kind of interested in this and interested in hearing you talk about this. Because there's a Central American country I've been to, I guess 25 times by now. It's a tough country, and I get around in the language and so on. But I'll share an experience I had with you, and then I'm interested in just hearing what you have to say. So there's a particular time, maybe it was after the 15th time I'd been there. I'd learned the language pretty well, getting along in the language. As you probably, maybe you've experienced this, humanitarian work can kind of be like a drug. There is kind of that really uplifting feeling that comes from knowing that you're helping folks out. It had been 10 days of pretty relentless work. I get on the plane, tired, but it's that good kind of tired, like, wow, I just spent the last days really working, the last 10 days, really working hard, and doing objectively good stuff for folks. And it was a great feeling. And then the plane takes off, and I look out over the city, over the capital city, and I see what a massive city this is. And all of a sudden my heart sank, because I felt like, wow, what I actually accomplished over the last days was so minuscule. It had zero impact on what happened in the city. And I could objectively say, well, but there are some people that you helped out, but I saw the massiveness of the problem. You get what I'm saying? And I've been back about 10 times since, but ever since then, I don't know how to put it. I mean, I guess I lost a little bit of heart, I guess, because you see the hugeness of the problem as compared to the smallness of the effort, right? And so there's been perseverance there, but it has felt a bit more like work. So I guess now you've been at Burma much longer than I've been at work in this Central American country. So that's why I'm really interested in your perseverance. You described there's that passage where you feel discouraged. Burma's a lost cause, but then 40 pages later, you're still at it. You're doing office work by day, revolutionary by night. So I think perhaps in a way you've kind of already answered this, but I'm interested in just hearing whatever reflection you have in response to that.
It's a lost cause. It's a great cause. I mean, it's an important thing. And so many people now, like everybody has heard of it, and people know how important it is. So that's really been a major difference. Also, I had like a big win early on, which was 2,4-D spraying. The United States was giving 2,4-D and one of the Agent Orange herbicide ingredients to government, the dictatorship of Burma, to spray on the opium crops. And the United States had no oversight on it. They didn't have any of our people there to see how it was being used.
Yeah.
So I went and investigated it myself up in the Sun State and brought that documentation back and lobbied in Washington, and then there was a congressional investigation and the program got stopped.
Wow.
So then I thought, well, I can do anything, because that was during the Reagan war on drugs, which was what the war on terror, the war on any other number of things, have been like. It was like a really sacred thing at the time. You can't go up against that, no matter how bad and counterproductive the program was, which it was. They were using it on crops as well as opium poppies.
Yeah.
So then I figured, multinational petroleum companies, whatever, we can do these things. And sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't. Oil companies and mining companies will often do whatever they want, no matter what. I've learned that. but sometimes you can make a difference in other ways.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people that kind of dip into Myanmar a little bit and have had enough. I always felt like going back to a place was important, as you did in Central America. You know, the first trip is one thing, but then kind of going back. And even with,
Right.
and in the bamboo, in most cases, I went back a second time to meet
Mm.
the indigenous people.
Yeah.
The people are often kind of surprised when you do that. It's like, oh, you're the foreigners. I remember you, you know. But
Yeah.
that's useful, and being thorough and doing research and
Yeah.
asking.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
an example currently of somebody who crossed the border illegally for a television show and made a lot of effort into it. This is not in Southeast Asia, in another part of the world. And he put a lot of effort into it, but then he didn't really speak to anybody when he got there.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
you know, really, what's the point of that other than night vision in your hotel room?
Yeah.
Uh, so I would say to other people who are interested in that kind of work to maybe start slowly and do a lot
Mm.
of research, as you certainly are,
Yeah.
and then also think about the repeat visits, because that's when you
Yeah.
really find.
That's right. You know, you mentioned you're mentioning this defoliant, this Agent Orange-like defoliant that the Burmese government was spraying, and the U.S. I guess is making this available to the Burmese government to get rid of the opium plants, right, and the production of heroin. But as was the case with Agent Orange, I mean, it's damaging people, it's harming the animals, and harming other plants, etc. But that's one of the things I love about this memoir, because this you know, this American young person just hears about this thing and then heads off on this journalistic investigation, and I just find it so admirable and interesting, and honestly, I feel a little bit jealous. I mean, you know, it just
Well,
sounds like an
in fact,
incredible experience.
hey, this is American now. This is really my responsibility. I really need to
Yeah.
do something about it. Back then, most of this stuff involving Burma did not involve the United States because they were sort of scrupulously neutral during the Cold War. They didn't
Mm.
take sides.
Yeah.
They were very closed off as far as foreign investments until after 1988, when it just completely turned around to the other side of economic exploitation.
Yeah.
But back then, there wasn't much that we could say the U.S. had any involvement in, except that came up. And so then I thought, well, yes, I mean, now this is definitely something that I have to work as hard as possible to stop.
Yeah. Well, I admire that, and as I say, I admire it, and I'm also jealous. I think that would have been an incredible thing to experience. I suppose a question I should have asked at the outset is if you could. Well, let me read actually just the very last paragraph in the book, and again, this is a book, you know, published in the early '90s, right? So. I remember, do I have that right? I think is it '93? I think when it was published.
Still available in paperback and ebook, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Um,
yeah. So this is the very last paragraph, and the question is it's a twofold question, and that is just how would you describe what's been happening in Burma from from the late '80s to now, and how have things changed? And as you think about that, now you give 5 names here, and I'll probably mess up the pronunciations, but your very last paragraph of the book, you write, 5 brave gentlemen who figured in Burmese looking glass have since died. Chalerik Norfa, I probably got the pronunciation wrong, but Skalerta, Nai Non La, Sa Beni Tu, and Mo Heng, I think something like that. You say they are greatly missed as revolutionaries and as my friends, and I regret that they did not live to see Burma liberated as it yet shall be. And so, well, that's a good, sort of revolutionary statement there.
yeah,
But
let me,
how would you first of all sort of summarize if you had to summarize, what's been going on in Burma for a few decades now, and then how have things changed?
Well, Aung San Suu Kyi is the pivotal figure, of course. During the 90s, she was a political prisoner and stood up against the military, and a great hero and Nobel Peace Prize winner and so forth. Then after 2015, her political party and her were able to enter the government in a power sharing agreement with the military. Around that time, I thought, well, there are going to be certain indicators whether this is for real. Burma has gotten what those students in 1988 died for, freedom, democracy. And the indicator was going to be, did the war in Kachinland in the north stop? Did the rape of ethnic women stop? Those are two basics. So under her watch, in power sharing with the military, the war in Kachinland has not stopped. In fact, there was increased aerial bombardment, an escalation of hostilities there and in other places in the north. And then obviously violence against women, including sexual violence, rape of women and children in northern Rakhine state, where the Rohingyas have been driven out, killed, their villages burned and obliterated completely, again, on their watch. So I can't call Burma liberated, although there's much more freedom of speech, there's more freedom in the arts, in environmental work, many, many things have changed. Internet access, everybody's got a cell phone. A lot of people have a motorbike instead of the ponies we used to ride around on.
Yeah.
There have been many changes, and many of them have been very, very good, and they've enhanced civil society's ability to make more changes, basically, to stand up for what's right. But she has not been a part of that. She's been quite on the opposite side of that, to many people's disappointment and suspicion.
Yeah.
And in northern Rakhine state, it's not only the Rohingyas who are oppressed, but Rakhine Buddhist civilians are now under terrible threat of war crimes because the Burmese military, the Tamadas is called, the army of Burma, are fighting their usual way, which is to go after the civilians first and scorched earth campaigns. So it's still going on in the same place. There is Tamada occupation in many places. The last time I was in Myanmar, Burma, was in 2016, and it was not in a war zone by any means, but there was a heavy Tamada presence there.
Yeah.
So when they are there, they cause trouble, whether it's resource extraction, logging deals, abuse of local women. They shouldn't be there in such great numbers. And the Tamada has just proposed another multi-billion dollars of budget. I mean, they eat up a huge amount of the resources in the country. They're also involved in profiting from things like jade mining directly, from petroleum directly. So my priority above all, I would say, or my idea of what a good priority for the country would be, is troop withdrawal from areas where they're really not wanted or needed, where they are serving as an occupying force. And when you're in or hearing about the Karen area, that still has an effect on the Karens. There are places where their own group, the Karen National Union, are in charge. There are places where militia groups are in charge. There are places where the army of the government of Burma are in charge. So that all causes trouble environmentally and still on a human rights level, although it's much, much improved from previous times there.
So, one of the things you're describing is the Burmese government effectively waging a continuous war on ethnic minorities throughout the country, the Karen, the Kachin, the Rohingya, etc. What would be, not that it's a rationale that we would take seriously or consider, but suppose we were, from the Canadian Embassy, for example, and we just put the question to a Burmese official, look, this stuff is obviously going on. So what's the rationale? Why is this happening? Why has this been happening for decades? What's the point? What would someone from the Burmese government say?
Well, they're pretty good on blanket denials, which they're doing about the northern Rakhine situation currently. They always also use the classic fighting terrorism rationale that's very popular with many countries, including ours and others. Yeah. So they will call whoever is resisting them terrorists, and that they have to, order all these weapons from Russia or China or wherever to fight them. They're holding the nation together. That's the world view, as it were, is that they're the army is your mother and your father, the billboards used to say, that they're the force that can hold the nation together. And I can in no way give an opinion on why Aung San Suu Kyi has gone along with this, but some people think it's because her father was basically the founder of the military of Burma during World War II, not long after he was assassinated. But maybe she feels some kinship with them on that level.
So I'm guessing if there's a conflict and some Burmese soldiers are killed, then that could be used as, you see, we've got these terrorists and such outlying part of Burma, and so that's why we have to put down the terrorists who are threatening our country. But
we usually don't need that much of an excuse. Often there are resources involved. But that is one not untypical scenario. And then they have certain light infantry divisions that are particularly brutal, that can conduct a massive scorched earth campaign whenever needed, like LID 33 and 99. These are known who the officers are, who the responsible people are. In the days of Burmese looking glass, there weren't satellite maps, but there sure are now. The Reuters reporters who were recently released from a long imprisonment in Burma, in Myanmar, were there because they had investigated a massacre of Rohingyas and written an amazing, thorough Reuters news report. So this stuff comes out, it is revealed, and it's revealed a lot faster than it used to be because of internet.
Now, were these 5 you mentioned at the end of your memoir, were they killed as a result of the conflict?
No, they were kind of the elder statesmen. Basically. They were from the World War II generation.
Oh, wow.
And some of them were involved in the fighting, and some of them, like scholars, were basically peace activists. When he first met me, he said, "Are you a peace person?" I said, "Well, oh," and he said, "Good. We'll start a movement together."
Yeah.
Because as righteous and just as the cause was that they were fighting for, there was also, always this sense of fatigue that had been going on basically nonstop since World War II, when their side backed the Allied British-American side, and the people who became the Burmese army. So that's something that you see in many places around the world, whether it's Kurdistan or Afghanistan or the Montagnards of Vietnam, where they aid the superpower of the time as indigenous fighters, but then they're abandoned to their fate when the big power part of the war is over, and the rest of them, yet the war continues.
Yeah, yeah. Something you said a minute ago reminds me of a passage in your book. I think it might have been when you were walking on the beach on this long forced march you were part of. I love the bit where the guy asks you, I forget exactly how it goes, but he says, what we're going to do is going to take a lot of walking, and you tell him well, you'd just been on a long trip, but forgot to mention that you'd ridden a donkey most of the time and hadn't actually walked. So anyway, so then you go on this long forced march, which is a great part of the memoir. And I believe it's during that passage where during that section of the book, where you sort of reflect on the fact that this was a war that you had chosen. The people here in Burma had this inflicted on them because of their ancestry, is how you put it. But this is a war that you had chosen. And so my question is, what sorts of things practically, and I do like your practical approach, I like philosophy and so on, so long as it comes down to earth really quickly, just purely abstract stuff, I lose interest really fast. So suppose you have, folks who are interested, who read your memoir and feel interested, feel inspired to do something practical. What sorts of things might folks do?
Well, they really have to take their cues from the local people themselves. Things will go completely wrong if they just decide to do something on their own. And now there are these civil society networks, and ask if there any way that I or we can support this. That's absolutely how to go. Yeah, ask first. Don't jump into any of this.
Yeah, just don't go crashing across the border and
crash across anything. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was a lot happier when I was riding a pony or a mule. I am not a 40-pound pack person. I'm not even a 20-pound pack.
Yeah.
And then Burmese Looking Glass was before the Tiva was invented, so I never had the right foot gear. Once the Velcro sandal happened, then everything was way better.
Yeah, you mentioned the sort of shoes you're wearing, and I thought those aren't hiking shoes.
Absolutely awful. Yeah.
Like Nike high tops or something, Reebok high tops or something. What's that? Yeah.
So when in the latest book, In the Wind and the Bamboo, I was around people who were pretty well barefoot, including marathon runners running barefoot, and that's the best thing to me.
Yeah.
No whatsoever.
So by you referred to getting in there and ask how can I help? What can I do? And listen and follow the lead of the locals, which obviously is very good advice. What sort of things have you seen, practical things that outsiders have been able to do that are genuinely helpful? Not just sort of, I'm sure you've probably seen this, the outsiders who step in with the kind of I'm going to save the world kind of thing. But, folks who step in, who really want to be helpful, who are respectful of the locals, who want to be helpful in a way that the locals will think is helpful. What are some of those practical ways, those practical things that folks have done that is genuinely helpful to the Karen, the Kachin, and some of the other folks who have been facing this sort of consistent pressure from the government for decades?
There have been some very good environmental efforts. There's a group called Earth Rights International that has training schools that environmental young activists from all over the region come to learn how to stand up for their own land rights in their own areas. So that kind of training, that kind of distribution of information is really important. There are major, major environmental vulnerabilities in Myanmar these days. So that's important. There are people supporting the arts there, distribution of things that people make. You know, there's a really great flourishing of art and music and performance in Yangon, or Rangoon, the biggest city in the country these days, and interplay with foreigners on that. It's been really fantastic, I think. In the refugee camps in Bangladesh, where the Rohingyas are by the hundreds of thousands, a lot more support is needed, but the main thing that's needed there is really respect and listening to the Rohingyas themselves. Originally, when they came there, it was in crisis mode, and everybody was thrown into, you know, tents with blue tarps. And it stayed in crisis mode for way too long instead of being treated really as an urban area. I mean, the refugee camps there are bigger than Portland, where I live. It's basically a city. And there was a lot of top-down decision-making by the international organizations. That's finally starting to change, where they're respecting the opinions of the Rohingyas themselves. But that kind of thing is really important as far as people who are working there, again, listening to them. So.
Yeah, sure. And in a number of your, in some of the lectures I listened to that you've given, you mentioned a real interest in education among the locals as well. Is that useful? Folks coming in, for example, and just teaching math for a week, and like, for example, I know of an organization that has what it calls jungle universities, where, you know, folks will come and teach math. They'll teach medical skills, maybe do English lessons. Is that useful as well, do you think, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, it has been over the years useful. Again, now there are more local people with those skills than there used to be.
Yeah.
So it's not quite, I would say, the crying need that it was previously.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that is still, you know, a possibility, certainly.
Sure. Yeah. Well, my last question for you is, of course, we want to be hopeful, and also I love you know, the expression "keep your eyes on the stars and your feet on the ground," right? So we want to be hopeful, but also, you know, see things as they are, but also see how things can change. And as you look ahead, you know, given your long experience now with Burma, as you look ahead 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, just sort of, you know, just your sense of things, what do you think can be hoped for in a realistic way, but what sort of things do you think can be hoped for when we look at this country the size of Texas, the size of France, in Southeast Asia?
I've always been hopeful. I've never been a good predictor of Burma or Myanmar events. One of the interesting things is how incredibly unpredictable they generally are, even experience. I'm good at identifying particular aspects to pay attention to, but as far as what's going to happen next,
Sure.
you know, will the military be pushed out of politics by a change in the Constitution? That's probably the single most pivotal aspect. Will troops be withdrawn rather than increased in the frontier areas? I don't know. It's doubtful that the country will be drawn into any conflict with its neighbors, but that's always been a slight possibility. So generally what happens in Myanmar stays in Myanmar. There's not much border conflict. But other than that, I think we just rely on civil society in the country. There's some amazing young people there. There is a peace movement throughout. People who are opposed to what happened to the Rohingyas, even though there was a lot of propaganda and a lot of Facebook shares against them, there are still people who understand it for what it was. And there's still many people who are against the war in the north who have peace marches over and over again. So that does exist in the country, and it has just a little bit of leeway, even though journalists and activists are still being imprisoned. There's plenty of political prisoners in the country. And with that, they do stand up for what's right in the country, and they'll continue to do so.
Yeah. Well,
and plus, and now really everybody knows about it, which kind of amazes me. That, you know, I still mispronounce Rohingya because I keep using a Burmese pronunciation and saying Rohingya by mistake. But everybody else that I meet, you know, in Portland, they know how to pronounce it properly because they have heard of people. They have been a witness to what happened to them, even if they'll never meet one in their life, even as a refugee here. So that awareness does count for something, that the world does know what's going on. So they're responsible too.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the importance of information, and that's sort of how you describe your work. You're an information gatherer and conveyor, and making information available to others. I really appreciate you you taking the time, and I really, there's I don't know how to describe it, but just reading the memoir, I just felt like this is a person I really like a lot. I mean, I really admire. There's an obvious degree of courage there, and again, just you hear about this defoliant that's being used, and you just want to go check it out and learn about it, and then you take that, and things happen, and I really admire that. I admire your perseverance, sticking with this topic. I mean, even exemplified that you took the time to talk with me. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted, Preston. I just wish it was in Arkansas, and then there'd be some barbecue after.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm also really honored to be in the company of the people that you've interviewed, because you have these amazing interviews with the veterans of the Second World War and the Vietnam War and wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I'm very impressed that you're doing this project, because that's the heart of the matter, is to have their voices heard as well.
That's right. That's right. I appreciate that. Well, thank you very much, Edith. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.